Now, have you ever been in a situation where you just don't know what to do next? 3 months ago, I was in India with two of my really good friends, Kyle and Harrison. We were on a mission trip, and it was awesome. We went to this town called Agra, India. Now, that's where the Taj Mahal is. Taj Mahal, one of the wonders of the world. It's this giant white marble mausoleum that a king built for his wife to be buried in like 500 years ago. But there's also a house church there in Agra that we visited. Now, this house church is really cool. It started about 6 years ago. There was a guy named Pastor Revi, and he was a Bible college professor in another town in India. And he felt like God was calling him to Agra to go plant this church. So he went to go plant this church. He didn't know anybody in Agra, just got there, decided he'd just start meeting people. So he was hanging out, and this woman, he just happened to come across her and started talking to her, and found out quickly that she had cancer. She had some sort of inoperable cancer, and basically it was a death sentence. So Pastor Revi asked her, would it be okay if I pray for you? And the woman said, yeah, that's fine, go ahead. So he went ahead and prayed for her. And then she went to the doctor a few weeks later, and she went to the doctor, and the doctor looked at her, examined her, and then told her that there was no sign of cancer anywhere. Man, God is doing some amazing things in India right now. She went back and found Pastor Revi, and she said, hey, I don't know what you did. I don't know who you prayed to, but I want some of that in my life. And so he said, well, let me tell you about Jesus. So he started telling her about Jesus. And then that grew into about 15 different house churches that have about 400 people that go to them. And so they needed a building, but they couldn't afford a building. And so they partnered with a church here in America, Savannah Christian. And through our global outreach, we were able to supply them with a church building, with just a house that they could meet at. And so 3 months ago, Harrison and Kyle and I are meeting in this house church. And picture a place that's about half the square footage of this stage. But there's about 100 people there. I mean, you couldn't sit down without touching at least 5 other people. And we go there and we worship, and then I have an opportunity to preach. And then at the end of it, our interpreter's there. And he's like, hey guys, we're on a tight schedule. We got to go. So he walks out. But the 3 of us are left there. And in the Indian culture, what we found out is you have to shake hands with everybody before you leave the church. So we had to shake hands with like 100 different people on our way out of the church. And everyone, we're shaking hands. And all the Hindi that we know is Jamasiki, which is praise Jesus. So we go through about 75 different handshakes in Jamasiki. And then this mother comes walking up towards the front, dragging what is obviously her daughter, and making a beeline for my friend Kyle. Now, Kyle is a bit of a celebrity in India because people don't grow to be 6'4" very often there. So he kind of stuck out, and this woman comes up to him and dragging her daughter and reaches for his hand and then tries to get them to touch hands. And we don't know what's going on because in India, we've heard about these things called arranged marriages, and we're not sure what the scenario is. So Harrison and I are looking at each other, and we're both thinking, dude, don't grab that girl's hand. Dude, just stop. And so this mother starts chattering at us in Hindi, and Kyle's trying to be polite, but clearly is not going to grab this girl's hand. And this mom is just chattering at us in Hindi, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. So finally the pastor walks by, and we're like, Pastor Revi, what's the situation? So he talks to her, and then he looks at us and goes, oh, she wants you to pray for her daughter. And we're like, oh yeah, well good, we can do that, that's no problem. And so then we ask, well, is there anything special that we need to pray for? And so he talks to the mom again, then he looks at us and goes, yeah, if you'd pray for her, she's possessed by a demon. And then he just walks away, goes to the other people in the church to take care of. And so Kyle, Harrison, and I are sitting there and we look at each other and it's like, dude, this is a new one for me. Yeah, me too. So let's pray. So, we brought this girl in and, just like Jesus in the New Testament, we followed that example, asked that in the power of Jesus, she would be protected and rescued from this evil spirit. And when we're done, this girl just kind of collapsed to the ground, like she was fatigued, not like convulsions or anything, but just kind of fell down almost like she went to sleep. And because we were on a tight schedule, we had to leave right away. So that's the last we saw of her. And then we talked to Pastor Revi that night. So we're talking to Pastor Revi and we're like, hey, what's the deal with this girl? Because, you clearly deal with more demon possession than we do. And we're just, what's the deal? So he started talking to us about her, and he said, you know what? This girl, when she's at church, she gets some relief. But then she goes home, and her family worships all these Hindu gods. And when she goes home, they worship these Hindu gods, and they try and get these Hindu gods to relieve her of the demon. And that doesn't work. And then when she comes to church, she praises Jesus and she gets some relief, but then when she goes back home, she goes back to her Hindu gods. So he said she's not going to be rescued from this demon as long as she keeps kind of a foot in both camps. I mean, that's so true. Jesus says it this way. He's preaching the Sermon on the Mount, and he says that nobody can serve two masters. He says either you'll love the one and hate the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. Man, we're going to be looking at two different people today. Actually, we're going to be looking at a group of 4 godly men on one side. Men who've decided that God is God all the time. But then on the other side, we're going to be looking at this pagan king who's maybe the most powerful man in the world, but who wants God some of the time, but not the rest of the time. And it just doesn't work out for him. Because God is not someone who suffers allegiance with anybody else. Today we're in the story. We're in the story chapter 16. If you have your Bibles, we're in the book of Daniel. So go ahead and open up there if you want to. We're going to be there in the first 4 chapters today. But for the past 4 months, we've been working our way through the story, the history of the world, specifically the history of God's people. So we remember, God created the world, then the Jewish nation started through this guy named Abraham. God called him and said, I want you to leave your people, your nation, your father's household, and come follow me. So Abraham packed up everything he had and went and followed God. Then fast forward 400 years. Now there's over 1 million Israelites, but they're enslaved and oppressed in the country of Egypt. And they cry out to God, and God sends a rescuer named Moses. There's these 10 plagues. They're led out of the hands of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and they're led to this place called the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, which then became Israel. Now fast forward 300 years past that, and we're in Israel. The Israelites have been ruled for the last 300 years by judges, and they've kind of mostly followed God's command to get rid of all the other nations in this land. And then they decide that they want a king. So they come to God and they say, hey, God, we want a king. All the nations around us have kings. And God says, no, you don't want a king, because with the king comes a lot of baggage. With the king comes taxes. With the king comes your sons are going to have to be in his army. Your daughters are going to have to go serve. And besides, God says, I'm your king. You don't need another king. And the Israelites said, no, God, we want a king. And so God says, fine, if you want a king, you can have a king. So they start out, and this first king, Saul, is not a great king. But the second king was a man named David. Man, he's a guy who killed a giant, helped Israel become, and led Israel to becoming a world superpower. This incredibly strong army, a very wealthy nation, lots of prosperity. And then David had the son Solomon. And during Solomon's reign, Israel went to even new heights. Solomon was literally the wisest man who ever lived. He built this temple to God. But Solomon was really devoted to only one thing, and that was women. The dude had 700 wives, which for those of you keeping score, that's about 699 too many. All right, this led to many problems in his life. One of the problems is all these wives started worshiping false gods. So Solomon started worshiping these false gods. And at that point, Israel started trending downward. In fact, Israel got in a lot of trouble in the next generation. Solomon had the son Rehoboam. Rehoboam was not nearly the leader that his father or his grandfather was. And in fact, during his reign, the kingdom was broken into 2 different kingdoms, to Israel and Judah. Pretty soon after that, Israel had this string of kings that was just completely godless. And that country was conquered. Judah had some kings that were kind of godly, and then some totally godless kings as well. And they made it almost another 200 years before they were conquered. And we pick up the story in about 605 BC. There's this king from Babylon, this Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar. And his father was a king, and then Nebuchadnezzar became king. And Nebuchadnezzar is just a mess. He's an egotistical monarch who's absolutely ruthless, who has a good military mind, but he's one of those people, I think the closest comparison is he's kind of like the Red Queen in Alice of Wonderland. I'm from Kansas, remember that. So his solution for everything that doesn't go his way is just kill whoever the problem is. Just kill him and get rid of him. So in 605 BC, he comes and lays siege to the country of Judah, and specifically to the city of Jerusalem. And then the city eventually falls. And so he sends the chief of his officials through. And he says, I want you to recruit some young men from Jerusalem into my service. I want you to go through and find all the young men who are bright, handsome, athletic, and basically the elite. I want you to pull them into my service and train them as Babylonian advisors. And this does two things. First of all, it helps Nebuchadnezzar because it adds some new blood, some new leadership, some new minds to his court. At the same time, it removes any threat from Israel because then anybody who would be a leader, anybody who might try and lead a rebellion is moved out of Israel. So he gets his officials to recruit these guys. So they go in and they find young Jewish men who show a lot of potential, and they pull them in and have them go through this training to be Babylonian court officials. Now, this is a 3-year training in things like astrology, astronomy, medicine, literature, philosophy. And so he has them go through this training. And this is where we pick up these 4 guys. There's a guy named Daniel, and 3 of his friends. They're given Babylonian names, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. And these guys are young, godly men that are pulled into Nebuchadnezzar's service. And Nebuchadnezzar at this time has no regard for the God of the Israelites. In fact, one of the things that he did when he conquered Jerusalem is he ransacked the temple. He went to the temple and he took all the gold chalices and a lot of the gold decorations, and he took them out, moved them to Babylon, and put them in the temple of his gods. Because back in the ancient Near East, the way that you showed that you had dominion over someone's god is you ransacked his temple and then put the stuff as loot in your God's temple. And so these 4 young men are pressed into Babylonian service, and they go in and they start the training. And we see pretty quickly what kind of character these guys have. Because one of the first things that they do is they're given a Babylonian diet. Lots of wine, lots of meat, lots of vegetables. And they're put on this diet so that they'll be in peak physical condition. And in Daniel 1:8, we get a picture of what these Jewish men are like. Because they look at it and they say, you know what? This goes against our kosher diet. And it may have been that the meat that the Babylonians wanted them to eat had already been sacrificed to idols, but this went against the diet that they felt that God had given to them when he gave all the commandments down to Moses. And so we read this in Daniel 1:8. Daniel says this, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine." And this was a little thing that they did. They were in a room full of other men. There were no other Jewish people around. It would have been really easy for these guys to say, you know what, let's just go with the flow, not make a big deal out of it. But they said, no, man, we are going to stick with God's rule. And this is one of the first lessons we learn about character in this. And it's this. It's the little things that make up our heart and our character. Man, if you don't take anything else out of tonight, take this. It's the little things that refine our character. It's the big things that reveal our character, but it's the little things that we do and the little things that we say and the little decisions that we make that refine our character. So Daniel and his friends, they decide they don't want to eat this food. But then the king's official comes up to him and says, Daniel, why are you guys not eating this meat and drinking this wine? And Daniel says, look, it's against our God's law, so please can we just not have this? And the king's official says, Daniel, you know what? I can't let you do that because if you guys look like you're in poor health, it's going to cost me my life. And Daniel said, well, how about this? We're on a 3-year program. So how about you give me 10 days? Feed us a diet of fruit and vegetables and water for 10 days. And if at the end of 10 days we look like we're healthy, then let's go with that. And so the king's official looked at him and said, you know what? Yeah, that'll work. So they do that. And at the end of 10 days, Daniel and his friends look healthier than anybody else there. And so the king's official says, okay, you guys can keep this diet. So God moves through that. So these guys go through their 3 years of training. And at the end of 3 years, they go before the king. Now, this is pretty important because you go through these 3 years of training, then you go before the king, and you have basically your oral exams. King asks you questions, you answer, and it's no stress, but if you don't answer correctly, there's a good chance you'll end up dead. So you want to make sure you get the answers right. So these guys go before the king, and they answer so well that Daniel actually, the book of Daniel tells us that the king found them to be 10 times more capable than anybody else, than any of the other wise men or magicians. So the king said, yeah, these guys are in my service. So they were pressed in and they became officials in the king's court. And so now they're in, and now we see 3 different events in the life of Nebuchadnezzar where we see God moving to get his attention. And we see the difference between his character and then the character of Daniel and his friends. The first one is in Daniel chapter 2. And Nebuchadnezzar one night has this dream. And it's this pretty epic dream. It's about this giant statue made out of all these different materials. And then there's this giant stone that comes and crushes the statue. And Nebuchadnezzar wakes up and has no idea what it means, but feels that it was important. He knows it's a message that he's supposed to get. So he calls all his wise men in, and he says, hey guys, I need you to interpret a dream for me. And the wise men said, yeah, that's no problem. We'll take care of it. Just tell us the dream. And Nebuchadnezzar goes, no, that's not going to work for me. I want you guys to prove that you're actual magicians. I want you to tell me what I dreamed and then tell me what it meant. And these guys look at him and said, King, that's impossible. We can't tell you your dream. But if you tell us your dream, we'll interpret it and let you know what it meant. And Nebuchadnezzar goes, no, seriously, tell me my dream. And they said, King, we can't do that. Nebuchadnezzar goes, well, how about this? Tell me my dream or I'll put all the wise men in Babylon to death. And so these wise men look at him and go, we can't tell you your dream, King. We don't know what it is. So Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, let's put all these men to death. So he sends out his official, this guy named Arioch, to go put all the magicians and wise men in Babylon to death. So Daniel finds out about this, and Daniel goes and intercepts this guy Arioch and says, what's going on? And he says, well, Daniel, I need to kill all the magicians and wise men because it's the king's order, because nobody can interpret the dream. And Daniel says, give me a day. Let me talk to the king. Let me get some time, but give me a day. Let me pray to God, and we'll see what we can do. So he goes before the king, and the king says, yeah, it takes some time. So Daniel then goes back to his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He says, hey guys, here's the deal. King had a dream. We need to figure out what it meant. God's got to give us this. Otherwise, we'll be put to death. And so those three friends and Daniel spent all night praying. They got down on their knees and just asked God to give them the interpretation, both the dream and then the interpretation. And God gave it to him. The next day, Daniel comes before Belshazzar. And it's right up here, Daniel 2:26 through 28. This is, I think, the second thing that we see that godly people do. But this is what the king asked Daniel. He said, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? And Daniel answered, he said, no, I can't do that. No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. You see, the second characteristic is godly people always point back to God. Daniel had an opportunity here when he came in where he could have said, yeah, king, I have the interpretation. But instead he said, no, king, I can't do it. That's impossible. But there is a God who can. So then he explained to Nebuchadnezzar this dream and how the different materials represented different kingdoms, and then this giant stone represented God's kingdom, which was more powerful than any kingdom on earth. And he explained it to Nebuchadnezzar. And at the end, Nebuchadnezzar was so impressed that he actually offered sacrifices to Daniel. And then we see how Nebuchadnezzar doesn't get it, because at the end of Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar offers praise, but really offers praise to Daniel and not to God. He says this, it's at the very end of Daniel 2, verse 47. He says, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Nebuchadnezzar, he doesn't quite get it. He recognizes, or he's starting to recognize anyway, that Daniel's God is powerful, but he doesn't see any connection between him and God yet, because he said, look, Daniel, this is on you. Your God is powerful, but you were the one who interpreted this. And so Daniel then was promoted. He said, Daniel, I want you to be over all the wise men. And then he took these three guys, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and they were put over the province of Babylon. So fast forward here another year. So Nebuchadnezzar, he's had this one encounter with God, but it clearly did not stick. Because during the next year, he started to develop some pride issues. And he was pretty impressed with himself. He decided it was time to build a 90-foot tall image. And we're not sure what the image is of, but we're guessing it was probably of him. So he went ahead and he built this 90-foot tall gold image. It was 9 feet wide, and he was really proud of it. He put it out in the middle of a plain where it could be seen for miles and miles and miles. And then he calls all his wise men together and calls his heralds and his kingdom's officials, and he brings them together for basically the unveiling of this giant statue. And it's announced that this statue is to be worshipped. In fact, anytime you hear music and you list off all these instruments, anytime you hear any one of those instruments playing, you need to bow down and worship this image. And his magicians and his wise men, most of them, they're looking to get in good with the king. So they're like, yeah, king, this sounds like a great idea. So the music starts playing. Everybody starts worshiping, except for three guys. There's these guys, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Daniel is presumably off doing some kingdom business at this time, so he's not around. But these three guys, they took seriously when God said, you should have no other gods before me. So they refused to bow down. And there's some other wise men who were jealous of their high position. They came to the king, and they said, look, king, there are these guys, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. They're not worshiping. And these guys, the music plays, they keep standing. They're not worshiping or honoring your image. And King Nebuchadnezzar is furious. So he goes and he calls these three men in front of him, and he's like, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, what is going on? I have this image. You're supposed to worship it. The penalty of not worshiping is you get thrown into a fiery furnace, probably the furnace that built this statue, and you get burned to death. And so he goes, I'm going to ask you one more time, will you worship this image? This is where we see another characteristic of godly people. Man, godly people know what they're going to do before they get to the fire. These three guys turn to him and they answer in Daniel 3, 16, 17, and 18. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. They turn to him and they say, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. I mean, these guys look at him and they say, look, king, our God, the God we serve, he's able to protect us from this. But you know what? Even if he chooses not to, he's still God. We're still going to worship him. Man, I met up with my mentor, or one of my mentors, yesterday morning. I hadn't seen him in a while, and it was really good to catch up. But we were talking about this, and he was talking to me about how sometimes God answers prayer requests God, usually the reason that he answers prayer requests are either to glorify God, to grow our holiness, or sometimes just because he wants to. But on the flip side is, sometimes God doesn't answer prayer requests because of those same three reasons. Either to glorify himself, or to help us become more holy, or because he doesn't want to. And man, a verse like this, God has the power to do this, but even if he doesn't, he's still God. Man, the first half of that is great, right? I mean, God is strong enough to do this. God is big enough to remove this problem from my life. God is big enough to heal this loved one. God is big enough to do whatever it is I'm asking. Man, that first part of that verse is powerful, but that second part, that's where it gets tough, right? Because the second half is, but even if he doesn't, he's still God. Man, that second half is the difference between us being consumers and God being someone that acts on our behalf and on our whim, and us being actual followers and disciples of Jesus who say, you know what? Just like Jesus did when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, say, you know what, God? Your will be done. I trust you. I trust that you have my good in mind. I trust that you have my holiness in mind. And even if you choose not to do what I ask you, you're still God. So these guys, King Nebuchadnezzar, he's furious when he hears this, just beside himself with rage. And now this has become almost a status thing because these guys have talked about how powerful their God is. So now Nebuchadnezzar needs to prove that he's bigger, badder, and better. So he orders that the furnace be heated up 7 times hotter than usual. So they pile this furnace in, it gets heated up 7 times hotter. Then Nebuchadnezzar calls the strongest men in the army, basically Babylonian special forces, has them come in and tie up these men and then go throw them in the furnace. And the furnace is actually so hot that the Babylonian soldiers are killed as they're walking up to it. So they die, but their dying act, they kind of push these 3 guys into the furnace. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fall into this furnace. And man, this is one of those times where you want to be a fly on the wall, because what happens next is just truly miraculous. Because a few seconds later, all of a sudden, King Nebuchadnezzar turns to everybody else and he's like, hey, remind me guys, but how many people did we throw in the furnace? And they look back at him and say, well, King, it was 3. And he goes, well, I see 4 guys in there. And actually the 4th one looks like he is a son of the gods. And he wasn't sure what he was seeing, but he saw 4 guys in the furnace. So he immediately calls these guys out. He says, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, come out here. So they come out, and by the time they get out to him, their hair's not singed, their clothes are fine, they're not tied up, they don't even smell like fire at all. Perfectly fine. And the fourth guy wasn't with them when they got out, but Nebuchadnezzar identified him as a messenger of God. Some scholars even think that was Jesus, the Son of God, who was there with those men in the fire. But they come out, and King Nebuchadnezzar looks at him and says, man, your God is powerful. And this is at the end of Daniel chapter 3. He says this. He says, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Man, he's starting to put it together. He gets to the point where he's like, okay, like your God is powerful. I'm starting to get that. Your God is more powerful than my furnace, more powerful than my image. But he hasn't quite made that connection with himself yet. You know, he says, praise be to the God because he rescued you guys. You guys trusted him, you guys defied my orders, and he rescued you. But he hasn't quite figured out that one-on-one connection yet. But that's the second event that happened. But those guys, they knew what they were going to do before they stepped into the fire. But then we see one final act, and this is the one that really gets Nebuchadnezzar's attention. This is in Daniel chapter 4. And Nebuchadnezzar, he has one more dream. Where he has this dream, it's again this kind of mysterious dream about this tree that grows up, and it's this giant tree, spreads out, gives shade to this giant piece of land. There's birds that perch in the branches. And all of a sudden the tree is chained up, the tree's cut down, and then the dream kind of ends with the tree being a little bit restored, but not totally. And Nebuchadnezzar, we see here that he's actually starting to learn, because instead of the rest of his magicians, he goes straight to Daniel. He calls Daniel in and he says, Daniel, you know, I need help. This is my dream. What's it mean? And Daniel looks at him, and Daniel was actually really upset by this. And he goes, King, I wish it were about somebody else, not you. And the king goes, no, tell me what it's about. And so Daniel said, well, it's actually a warning from God, because King, your pride is starting to get out of hand. And he said, this tree actually represents you. You're one of the most, maybe the most powerful man in the world. But your pride is starting to get totally out of hand. And if you don't rein in your pride, if you don't check yourself, then God is going to do something big to humble you. In fact, he says, if you don't turn away and if you don't humble yourself, God is going to take you and God is going to make you like a beast of the ground. You're going to live in the wild. You're going to lose your sanity. You're going to eat grass, and you're going to go and live like that until you recognize that God is God. And so Nebuchadnezzar said, well, you know, what do you say when someone tells you a dream like that, right? I'll change. So Nebuchadnezzar, it must have got to him, because for the next year, he's okay. But a year later, he's walking around, and he has one of these moments where he just realizes how great he is. Man, about 6 years ago, I was in college, and I was helping be a stage manager for a production of Fiddler on the Roof. And one of my professors, he had this little 5-year-old daughter, and she played one of the youngest daughters in the play. And one day before we started, it was about half an hour before we went on stage, I heard this noise coming from one of our back dressing rooms. So I walked back there and just peek in, and there's this little girl, and I think her name was Amy, and she had on this big wide dress. And I don't know if she had a dress like that before, but she's sitting there spinning in a circle, just kind of singing to herself, I'm the most beautiful girl in the world. I'm the most beautiful girl in the world. Now, when you're 5 and you're a little girl wearing a big dress, that works. When you're a king who's the most powerful man in the world, has been warned about your pride, it doesn't work quite as well. He's up there walking around his palace. He looks around at everything, and he goes, wow, look at everything. Look at this city that I've built. Look at this country I've built. Look at everything that I've done in the splendor of my hands. And God says, no, that's enough. This pride is just completely out of control. So at that moment, Nebuchadnezzar was struck with some sort of mental illness. He left his palace. He left the city of Babylon. He went and lived in the wild. He ate grass. He lived, actually, Daniel describes it as like an ox in the field. And he spent 7 years of his life doing that. And at the end of 7 years, he said he lifted up his eyes, his sanity was restored, and he recognized who God was. So then he came back, and when he came back, his kingdom was restored to him. He again became Nebuchadnezzar, the king and the emperor of Babylon. But that was what finally did the trick for him. Because when we read the very last words that Nebuchadnezzar ever wrote in the Bible, you can see that it's a changed man. It's at the end of Daniel 4. And Nebuchadnezzar, he's talking, and he says, look, God can humble. He says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Man, the last thing we recognize is that, a godly person has no room at all for pride. That was Nebuchadnezzar's last big hang-up. He was a guy who started out, and when he first started, he had no idea who this God of Israel was. He has that first dream. Daniel interprets it, and he's like, wow, Daniel, good job. Good job, you. And then these three guys, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they're thrown in the fire. God rescues him from the fire. And Nebuchadnezzar then takes another step, and he's like, wow, your God is powerful. He rescued you. But then he got to this third one, and he realized that he too needed to be rescued. And he said, wow, God can humble the proud. And I'm going to praise and exalt God because he finally got my attention. And I think it was the character of those four Jewish men that led him to that point. That prayer that Meshach, Shadrach, or that response that Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego gave the king, where they said, look, our God can save us, but even if he doesn't, he's still God. Man, 650 years later, Jesus, the night before he's crucified, right? He's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's praying, and he has a very similar moment with God, where he's praying, and he says, God, let this cup pass from me. But then he says, but not my will, your will be done. In other words, God, this is not what I want to do, but I recognize that you're God and I am not. And man, if this is what needs to happen, then let your will be done. Man, that is a powerful prayer. That's not an easy prayer to pray either. Now, I would guess in a room this size, as we look at it, there's people all along the spectrum here, right? I would guess that there's some of us who are kind of like where Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego are. Where we decided to follow God. We've made him king of our life, and we're trying to follow him. Man, I think for this, we need to recognize, just like Daniel did in Daniel 1:8, but we need to resolve something. My mom, I grew up in Southwest Kansas. My mom is amazing. She's one of my favorite people in the world. But she was that mom who had like sayings. I don't know if your mom did, but she had like 7 or 8 go-to sayings. And it was like, no matter what the situation was, one of these sayings was going to fit, right? Now, I was kind of a strong-willed child, so there were times where I heard, change your face or I'll change it for you, or change your behavior or I'll change it for you. And there were other times where, she'd be talking and she'd say, patience is a virtue. Virtue is a grace. Put them both together and you get a happy face. You're like, Mom, when I'm impatient, struggling with patience, I don't want to hear rhymes like that. Sometimes she would look at my sisters and she would be like, listen, girls, face powder catches a man, but baking powder keeps him. And I'm like, Mom, I don't even know what that means. But one saying that she would give us is this. She used to tell us, watch the pennies and the dollars will take care of themselves. And that was great advice. But what that means is, watch the little things. If you pay attention to the little things, the big things will fall into place. And for some of us here, I would challenge us to look at the little things. Man, Daniel, he had a diet that he resolved himself. He resolved not to defile himself. Man, we're just starting a new year. And a lot of us are going to do New Year's resolutions, right? These things where we decide what we're going to change or what we're going to do in this new year. And most of us, or maybe not most of us, but some of us will make this list. Sometimes it'll be a lot of things. And we don't always follow them, but we resolve to do something at the new year. Man, here's my question for you. What is it that you need to resolve to do faith-wise in this next year? And maybe some of us need to resolve to clean up our internet life. Maybe some of us need to resolve to develop a prayer life. Maybe I need to resolve to find a small group. Maybe I need to resolve to get a mentor. Maybe I need to resolve to just find out more about Jesus. Man, there's that end of the spectrum. I would also guess some of us here in the room are maybe at the point where Nebuchadnezzar was on that line. maybe somewhere along his journey, maybe we right now don't even recognize God, don't even recognize Jesus in our lives. We're at the point where we just need to start asking questions, start finding out a little bit more about him. Maybe we're like Nebuchadnezzar where we realize Jesus is powerful, but he's for somebody else. And maybe we just need to resolve to find out how Jesus affects me and how Jesus intersects with my life more. Maybe we're at that part where Nebuchadnezzar realizes finally that Jesus and God have a role to play in our life, but we're hanging on to something, whether it's pride or something else that we need to let go of. So what is it that you need to resolve to do? This is what I want us to do for application. I want us to take our bulletins, and I want you to do this sometime over the next couple of days. I want you to rewrite Daniel 1:8, but I want you to put your name in there and whatever it is that you need to resolve to do. So for me, but Jake resolved not to defile himself through, but Jake resolved to do this. And rewrite that verse. Figure out what it is that God is calling you to resolve to do. Because it's the little things that refine our character. And man, when we watch those pennies, when we watch those little things in our character, and those little things as we're following Jesus, the big things fall into place. Those guys, they didn't need to figure out what they were going to do when that fiery furnace came. Man, they already knew. They'd already made their decision. They'd already practiced and implemented Christian habits in their lives for so long that response came so quick. God can save us, but even if he doesn't, he's still God, King. So let me do this. Let me pray for us, and we're going to have the band come out and we're going to sing a song, but let's pray.